Okay, hello. Like Akina said, my name is Lucy Hedges. I'm the technology editor for the Metro newspaper and a BBC presenter, so really happy to be here. And so hello and welcome. This is the third panel session of the day of the NGI Summit, in which we'll be discussing solutions or solutionism and the role of technology in times of crisis. Now, over the next 45 minutes, we'll be examining the role that the internet and emerging technologies can play in responding to crises and what it is that we can potentially do better to prepare us for systemic shocks, and asking the question, how do we ensure that technology solves complex problems effectively without excluding people, causing harm? Now, of course, solutionism is, that technocratic idea that all problems can be solved with technology. And in theory, that sounds simple enough, it sounds amazing, but practically, solutionists often don't realize that sometimes these tools are built and they're sometimes so powerful that they generate new problems. And that's basically, what we're going to talk about here. One recent example, of course, would be the tech community's rush or their response to COVID-19 and all the subsequent rush development of government-backed contact tracing acts, which of course sparked a series of conversations and ethical and practical debates about centralization, inclusion, the limits of data protection, and the threat of surveillance mission creep. So there's a lot to talk about here. On that note, I'd like to introduce my wonderful panelists. So we have Frederike Kaltheuner, Tech Policy Fellow at the Mozilla Foundation. We have Charlton McIlwain, Provost, for Faculty Engagement and Development and Professor of Media, Culture and Communication for NYU Steinhardt. And finally, we have Tricia Wang. Tricia's a global tech ethnographer and fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. There's our lovely panelists. This is a panel discussion, so it goes without saying we'd like to keep this quite interactive. So if you've got any questions or any thoughts that you'd like to share, make sure you pop those into the chat function and we will try and pick those up. I know our panelists would love to answer all your questions. And just to bring you up to speed on how this session will run, each of our speakers are going to start with a short statement outlining a potential future or past crisis, the hypothetical response from the tech community and what its unintended consequences might be, or what a better response might look like. And then we'll move to a wider panel discussion and then audience questions. So I think it makes sense to go in the order that I introduced you. So Frederike, are you there?
Hi.
Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I am really good, thank you. So let's start with your short opening statement and your crisis, your problem.
So we've been asked to describe a hypothetical crisis, which led to a response from the tech community that has created unintended consequences. I feel strange making up a hypothetical crisis when we're still very much in the middle of a crisis. So my opening statement is about outlining what I think is currently happening and what needs to happen in Europe in the next 6 months. So we are still very much in the middle of a global pandemic. It feels very different in different parts of Europe and in different parts of the world. And in most places, technology is no longer deployed in a state of emergency mode. But that doesn't mean that we need to stop reflecting on the role that technology plays in a crisis, because the situation itself is very fast moving and ultimately it remains unpredictable. So if we look at the last 6 months, all over Europe, we've seen very innovative, very responsible, but also quite risky and sometimes outright reckless uses of technology. And I think going forward, the goal should be to really minimize the risk and make sure that no harm occurs. And I think for the next 6 months or the next sort of year, perhaps, there are three key challenges that we need to address. I think the first one is we need to monitor and continue to monitor how tech is used in response to COVID. So that means be very careful of uses of technology with little or no evidence of their effectiveness. We need to monitor how data is used or misused, especially health data. And we need to make sure that voluntary measures don't become de facto obligatory, especially in contexts like the workplace. So that's the first challenge. The second one is, I think we also need to systematically learn from the last few months and make sure that we do better going forward. Again, this is a European perspective, but I think we've seen quite a shocking disconnect between governments that are quite eager to use technology and an existing community of experts and responsible technologists that could have helped to ensure that the technology is deployed responsibly. In some places, this worked better in others. Sometimes it took more time, but I think we really need to foster this connection. And I think the last point for me is, I think now more than ever, Europe or any place needs a very clear vision of the kind of technological future that we want. And this is quite urgent because as we're going into recession, the tech sector is poised to be stronger than ever. And we're seeing a very fast track digitization happening all over Europe. So it's really important and more important than ever to really steer this process and ask ourselves, technology is amazing. It can also be horrible. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the technological future that we want? And I think this really matters because if we learn lessons from past crises, is that the way in which technology is used in a crisis and the diffusion of norms that happens while technology is deployed can have long-term consequences for generations to come. And this is why we need to be responsible and careful now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Right. In the middle of an incredibly global pandemic, there's a lot of work to be done in the now. And, three really valid takeaways, monitor how tech is being used, learning from the last few months, and Europe needs a clear vision for a tech future. What is the tech future we want? That's a brilliant question. So that's your opening statement. Let's move on to Charlton. Hi, Charlton. Is he there? I'm not
They're
sure.
Not coming through?
Oh, he is. Oh, I thought we lost you for a moment there.
Okay. How's that? It's good?
We're good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. So let's hear what your crisis is and your solutions.
Indeed, like our previous speaker, I feel like I'm a better historian than I am a futurist. And so rather than thinking about a hypothetical scenario in the future and the ways that we might technologically respond, I want to zero in on lessons from both a historical and a more recent moment, COVID, of course, that exemplify where I think we are going wrong and where we do go wrong time and time again in our quest to imagine, design, and deploy technology in the service of solving problems. And it is indeed the problem that I believe is fundamentally our problem. And so two illustrations. Number one, in the US in 1964, the crisis that the President of the United States and white Americans believe was defined as a problem of crime. The crime problem was framed as a problem of race, a problem of poverty, a problem of the urban environment, a problem of Blackness. And so when Johnson commissioned a commission and a task force on science and technology and asked it to utilize new computing powers to help solve this problem, what did they build? A technology that could help eliminate the causes of poverty, a way to fix urban infrastructures to desegregate neighborhoods, produce greater access to transportation and employment? No, they developed what came to be called criminal justice information systems, law enforcement technologies that provided the ability to police, profile, surveil, and criminalize Black and brown communities. And by 1970, these technologies proliferated throughout the US and beyond, expanding the rampant criminalization of Black and brown people and laying the decades for foundation, or I should say laying the foundation for today's ubiquitous surveillance infrastructure that still disproportionately threatens communities of color. And so why did this happen? It happened because Blackness and Black people, not crime, was a real problem we designed those technologies to solve. We often call on technology to help solve problems, but when society defines, frames, and represents people of color as the problem, those solutions often do more harm than good. Blackness and Black people both persist as our nation's, dare I say, even our world's problem. When contact tracing first cropped up at the beginning of the pandemic, it was easy to see it as a necessary but benign health surveillance tool. The coronavirus was our problem, and we began to design new technologies in the form of contact tracing, temperature monitoring, threat mapping applications, etc., to help address it. But something both curious and tragic happened. We discovered that Black people, Latinx people, indigenous populations were disproportionately infected and affected by the pandemic. Suddenly, we also became a national problem in the US. We disproportionately threatened to spread the virus. That was compounded when the tragic murders of George Floyd by a white police officer sent thousands of protesters into the streets. When the looting and rioting started, we, Black people, were again seen as a threat to law and order, a threat to a system that perpetuates white racial power. And it makes you wonder how long it will take for law enforcement to deploy those technologies we first designed to fight COVID-19 to quell the threat that Black people supposedly pose to the nation's safety. And of course, time will only tell if that bears out. And so the point of all of this is simple, and it doesn't matter that my examples are coming from the US context. This applies to us broadly. And that is, if we don't want our technology to be used to perpetuate racism and bias, then we must make sure that we don't conflate social problems like crime or violence or disease or others with Black and brown people. When we do that, we risk turning those people into the problems that we deploy our technology to solve, the threats we design it to eradicate. Thank you.
Absolutely. What a fantastic example. And just an example of a response to, a problem that actually ends up being detrimental to a certain demographic and target audience. And this is clearly, and it's still happening. It's quite long term. So it's clearly a very detrimental problem. So Charlton, thanks for that. Tricia, hey. Oh, we don't have Tricia. Okay. Throw me off a little bit. Okay, so we've got two crises. We've got COVID-19 and we've got the criminal justice system information from the 60s kind of moving forward to now, blending with what's happening with the COVID crisis. So I'm now going to open up to a series of questions. We can bring in the examples or bring in your examples of these problems into the questions that I'm going to ask. So governments, they tend to jump to technological solutions in times of crisis, as we've discussed. How do we strike the right balance between technical and social interventions? Basically, how do we ensure solutions actually help our cause and don't create new problems? So who wants to dive in? Charlton?
Sure, I go in. I think, one of the things that is, I think, always at issue, and certainly has been the case with COVID, is when we have crises, our tendency is to want to act swiftly, to act immediately, to act as fast as we can because of the problem itself, the problem that presents. Demands such a reaction. But I think that often works against or making it counterproductive to really deploying solutions that solve the problems that we want it to solve. And I think what tends to happen is we begin new solutions on the heels of our past ones, and those are whatever is ready to hand, and we take from those. And so it was easy to see with COVID, for instance, that some of the first technologies that we saw were around mapping and surveillance, things that we already had tools for and simply needed to tweak and find new ways to apply them. And so I think, unfortunately, what is often needed to not go down this pathway is time for governments, time for those who are affected, time to be able to adequately know what the problem is, what the causes are of that problem, and thinking deeply about a solution that solves that problem specifically, and not a whole range of other problems that end up being inadvertent and taking us down the road of potential harms.
So do you think in some cases, this knee-jerk response to have a solution, and think sometimes, we do go down paths that just prove fruitless at the end. There's nothing at the end of the road. But do you think governments or, want to be seen to be doing something? rather than, so, you know, like you said.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think politicians see themselves as in the faces of their constituents, who they want or perceive to want to be doing something, to be acting, and often people don't see waiting and studying and researching and investigating as legitimate action. And so when someone comes along, a private company, a vendor, a contractor that says, hey, I've got a solution, it becomes easy to say, I'm acting by giving a new contract to build, expand, deploy this new technology. And here we've done something. And it's only later that we start to see either that this new technology that we've invested in as a government is either doing harm or is simply not doing anything.
Yeah. So it's really just about having a thoughtful adoption of technology rather than this rushed response to look to be seen like we're doing something. Yeah.
Right.
What about
most
you,
crises
Frederike?
are. Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say most crises, we know they have a similar shape. They might look different in kind, but we can anticipate them and we can plan for them. And so I think that's what is really the imperative.
Yeah. And do you think there's a big risk that we also see exclusion in the design of solutions?
I think one of the things that we know from most deployments of technology is that risks and harms are usually unequally distributed. We don't need a test to know this, that if you are, let's say, if you work in a really low paying job, if you're unemployed, if you're Black, if you're minority, these are the communities that are disproportionately affected. So this is something that we need to consider at the design stage and not as an afterthought. Something else I wanted to say, however, is that I find the framing of the word balancing really fascinating, because in the past few months, most discussions have been about balancing. So we need to balance privacy against public health. We need to balance fundamental rights against public health. And this reminds me really much of every single debate that happens after a terrorist incident happens. We need to balance privacy against security. And I think the problem of this balancing narrative, so to say, is that often these aren't mutually exclusive goals. And I think in the case of technology, we think about rights like privacy as something that are completely absolute, whereas even human rights law says, well, in an emergency, of course, rights can be restricted. But the question is, how is this being done? And what is really important is that this is done in a time-limited way, evidence-based, that there is a legal basis, and that sort of consequences aren't, and restrictions to fundamental rights aren't arbitrary. And I think we should be spending a lot more time talking about this, sort of like, is there real evidence that this technology is actually useful? If it is useful, if we only use it during a very limited time and it does not risk become infrastructure that stays around forever, then we can have the conversation. But the moment we say we need to balance rights against public health, we're in a pandemic. Of course, public health wins. I think that's not the right framing. It's sort of like, sure, there are restrictions to certain, like, we're all not living our normal lives at the moment, but the question is, what's the quality of these restrictions? And something I'm really worried about is what happens, what things are going to stick around. And I think things that I'm quite concerned about are workplace surveillance. There's been some ongoing trends in this area, and the pandemic has fast-tracked the deployment of tools that monitor workers, for instance, or certain kinds of communities. So we need to be really, really careful. Even if these tools currently serve a certain function, we need to double check whether they actually do, whether there are safeguards, and most importantly, whether they will be dismantled once they're no longer needed.
It's really interesting, isn't it? That you're asking the question, is tech useful? Does it serve a function? These are quite fundamentally really questions people should be asking themselves firsthand, not in hindsight. So it's really something so basic, something so obvious, but it's not working at the moment. I'm really sorry, guys. I'm not sure if you guys can hear. We've got a lot of feedback with other voices, so I apologise if you can hear that or if it's just me. So I'm not sure where that's coming from. I believe we have Tricia in the digital building. Hello, Tricia.
Wait, did someone just say my name?
Hi, Tricia. We are coming to you
Hi.
live. Hey,
Hi.
how are you?
Good. It's a little hard to hear, so there's a lot of echo. Is it just me?
Yeah, we're having some technical issues. I think all of us
Okay.
are experiencing that. So my other two panelists have given us their potential or current past and future crisis. So I'd like you to give your opening statements. If you
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry for the technical issues. I'm calling in from my phone because sometimes it appears that low-tech solutions are the best ones. I don't know what you just said, but I think I heard the word crisis and give your opinion. And I'm really sorry that I missed all the speakers before Charlton's work and Frederike's work. So apologies, but I heard some of the discussion, so I was able to catch on a bit. My perspective on this, I think, is in line with my co-panelists. A lot of my work is writing about the importance of personal data. And right now, I think we have a really big disconnect when we think about technology at all, because right now everything is framed under the concept of privacy as if like technology is violating our privacy and we're getting all upset about privacy if we are getting upset at all, or Facebook or Instagram or Tinder is taking away our privacy. But really, my work is around trying to help people understand that it's not just our privacy that's at risk, it's our entire personhood. And we need an entirely new language and concept for how we talk about this stuff. Otherwise, we're going to actually be serving corporations, which is corporatehood, because they would rather have us live in the world of privacy, because privacy is something that can be legally mediated. You can check box. You can be like, I hired a chief privacy officer, or I'm part of the IAPP. I'm part of the international, I think, the Association of Privacy Professionals. There's like so many of them, right? And then you have like a privacy task force, and everyone's like, are you, did you have a privacy TOC? Did you have this checked off? Did our users sign our privacy terms? When really, in reality, we need to think about personhood, which is the idea of we are that we have the ability to determine our own life decisions and outcomes. And that is personhood. That's the agency. Is tied to the qualities of us being people. And at this point, we have so much data tied to who we are that if we didn't have access to our data, or if we don't have control of it, that someone can control our lives through our data. And you see this most frequently right now in facial recognition and bad facial recognition, what happens with machine learning. And who does it impact the most? It's always people of color, in particular, people who are darkest skinned. So right now, if you combine that with the existing justice system that has hundreds of years of injustice and inequality and white supremacy built into that, the people who are affected the most are Black men. And in my work, I've looked at case after case where you see it happening over the last year right now, which is in particular Black and Latino men are being misidentified by the algorithm. And then local police stations, they work with companies like Google, and they just go and arrest people, and they just ruin people's lives. And so a lot of my work is trying to understand that all of these technologies, we can't just talk about framing it as an invasion of privacy. We have to think about a more widely shared language around personhood. And this actually comes from OECD's work. There was a really seminal report published about, I think, a decade ago, about talking about how personhood is a human right. And I would like us to, I think, one of my suggestions in my work is to say, I think we need to start adopting this language of personhood and tying it to human right, and to talk about how violations of privacy are different, because that's just violations of your data as commodity, whereas violations of personhood are actual violations of the person that's being represented by the data. And you see this everywhere, where even though we don't use language of personhood, but I would say that all the uprisings that you see right now happening in the US that now resonates with anyone who is oppressed, any group that's been oppressed around the world, with Black Lives Matters, is that like they didn't go to the street to be like, oh, I'm demanding my privacy. They were actually demanding the right for Black people to live without discrimination. In other words, their right to personhood. And you see this over hundreds of years of anyone who has been, I think, any group that has experienced injustice, genocide, slavery, human trafficking, wars. They understand very, very intuitively what the right to personhood means. And I think we think that this is different, but I don't think that the idea of personal data is any different from the fight that we had had to start around the Industrial Revolution, where there was a humongous social shift from enclosure to where the enclosure movement was a systematic removal of peasants from their land, even though no one owned land in the Middle Ages up till the 1700s. There was common land. People were not homeless. People had a right to farm their land. They worked for their landlord. And I'm not saying this is the best system or the right system, but the point is that there was an enclosure movement where it systematically said, we're going to remove common land. And it allowed landlords to consolidate land, and people were displaced from their land and they could no longer farm it. So they went into cities, and that became the working base for the Industrial Revolution. And I talk about this story often because I think we're going through a similar movement right now, where during the Industrial Revolution, people started to work in factories, and there was no concept of personal time at all. People's concept of time was tied to the sun and to the moon, for agriculture. But then what happened was that factory owners would control people's time. They wouldn't allow people to bring in watches. They thought it was a form of witchery, of orology. And when in reality, we all know witches are awesome. But they were actually preventing people from controlling their own time. And they wouldn't open doors, they wouldn't open the window so they could see what time it was. And when I was reading through all these personal experiences back then in the 1800s and 1900s, it's that people were talking about how time was a really big problem. And the first thing that unions organized around was time. It was a global movement to organize around the 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours of play. And that is how we get to our current structure right now of 8 hours of work. And what I'm reminded of is that people had to die for this. People had to march for it. People had to rally for it. And it had to be fought for in order for it to become policy. It took a couple hundred years. And in some places in the world, people are still fighting for the right to personal time. And we're going through something like that right now, which is that there is a movement from the physical to the digital space. And we also have to learn this language for personal data. And if we continue to tie it to privacy, I don't think we're going to get as far. We need to start tying it to our personhood in the same way that the unions were able to do this successfully back in the 1800s. I don't know how much time I have, so I can stop talking now.
In-depth and super fast timeline of what's been happening. Thank you so much for your contribution. That was really interesting. I've only got about 20 minutes left, so I've got a load of questions that I want to fire over at you guys. So I'm going to keep on doing that. And again, apologies for any feedback noise that you guys are getting that all of us are currently hearing. So we're talking quite a lot about infringements on people's rights here. Are there any tools that we can share with people to help them understand and enact their rights?
So I think a lot of work that's important from what I've seen is that people need to start tracking who's using their data. We have to start looking at what companies are using your data. And I think Markup just came out with a really great tool called Blacklight, where you can actually see how much of your data is being sent and tracked. But I think it's not just tools that we need. There's a lot of great efforts. I don't know what's happening around the world, but at least in the US, there's great organizations like Our Data Bodies. There's other associations where people are coming together to look at the infringements of AI. And I think that we need not so much more tools, but we need to actually invest in public education. We need to invest in communities coming together. And I know that sounds maybe this whole conference is about solutions, but I hope it wasn't just we weren't thinking about tech solutions, that we're also thinking about how communities are actually smart enough and empowered enough to come up with ways to come together around this. And that's why we need to see more people of color in positions of power inside educational institutions where a lot of this research is being done, so that it's not just corporations determining the way we have these conversations.
Yeah. So kind of investing in public education and community. So that's very, very important. So how do we involve the general public effectively when designing tech response challenges? How do we ensure that diverse perspectives are heard?
I mean, if I heard the question correctly, it was about how do we involve the public in a more deliberate way And I think, the answer to that, and, really want to go back to Tricia's words to sort of reiterate what the focus is, which is not necessarily on new tools. And I think someone mentioned earlier, and my friend and colleague Meredith Broussard has a term that she's coined called tech chauvinism, which is the tendency to think that with any problem, a new technology, a new tool is the solution to that. And I think that's often where we go wrong. And so I think our focus needs to be exactly where Tricia was mentioning on things that elevate both personhood, but also personal agency. And look, we could use tools all we want. The fact is that we won't be able to build or use them at a scale to match the surveillance infrastructure and capability that's working against so many communities of color that are out there and that are working and that are fighting. And so I think the way to involve communities more is, number one, to think about not just how do we involve the general public. I don't like the idea of a general public because that tends to mean that we end up serving those who already have access to power, privilege, to networks, and so forth. I think what we need to do, if we're talking about specific harms that we know tend to accrue to certain groups of people, then we need to be among those people. We need to be designing technologies with their voice in mind, and not even their voice in mind, but their voice leading the way. And so I think the way that we involve the public is to find those who we know already are always typically harmed by our technologies, and we need to go to them specifically and front load their voices, their concerns in how we chart a particular direction forward.
So, Charlton, a lot of your recent work focuses on the intersections of race, digital media, and racial justice activism. So obviously inequality and bias are incredibly important right now. You guys have just reiterated that. But what should policymakers and public sector decision makers watch out for to ensure the technologies they promote and deploy don't exacerbate inequality and bias based on socioeconomic status or ethnicity?
Well, I think they have to be aware of the history of those things in the first place. I mean, it's amazing to me how often you go to, let's say people who make technologies having to do with, mortgage lending and housing, which is an area that I've been involved with quite a bit. People who are building new systems who have no idea of the long history of segregation, of policies designed deliberately to make sure that people of color did not have access to being able to buy a home, to build wealth through home ownership, all of those kinds of things. So I think that the first place to start is for people to understand the nature of the problem, which often means starting with the nature of history. And I think that's where, the present and the past come into play. And, Frederike talking about the problem of now. And I love that we're going all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, because I think really that's where we got to start. History, these are not new problems in any sense. And we fail, and we have failed time and time again. And so I think we need to start with, and policymakers need to start with, learning the lessons of history.
Yeah, well, like you say, these aren't new problems, and I think people could learn a lot from what's happened in the past. We learn from mistakes, and looking at things in hindsight is a great way to see how we can progress and move forward. Frederike, one question for you. What are some of the key lessons learned about the government's role in technology development during the COVID-19 crisis, or during the crisis we're in now? It's not over.
I'm really careful to make any statements about this because it's so localized, and that it looked so drastically even within Europe. I've been between Germany and the UK, and it's two parallel universes. What I think is important, harms are not the result of people. Sometimes they are the result of people's bad intentions, but often they're the consequence of the best intentions. So I think the question is like, what should policymakers do when they deploy these tools? This is my bias because I work on policy. We need to have enforceable rules, and big technological system, it's not just about whether a particular app works in a certain kind of way. We don't have time to go into detail for this, but what's really fascinating about the entire contact tracing debate was that we're all embedded in sort of large infrastructure systems, and in the long or in the midterm and quite quickly, these need to be regulated. And this isn't sort of, even with the best intention, you might end up designing something that has implications you might not necessarily like. So I think it's important to talk about regulation and going back to how can we use the law to solve these problems.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So I was building on what Frederike and Charlton just said, is that I think policymakers need to start getting smart before they start actually advising where funds are going. I see that a lot of policymakers are working with new institutions that claim to already be solving this problem without any awareness. And we all of a sudden actually see this new generation of white males who are all of a sudden like, oh my God, the technology I built is doing harm and I feel so bad. And now we need to like actually come and have a conversation about this. And I can't tell you how often I see this on Twitter. And now there's a whole documentary being made about it on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, where not a single person of color has been interviewed. There have been, for a decade at least, so many scholars, so many writers who have actually been writing about the problems of technology and its impact on people of color and on communities. And what happens, all of a sudden, a white guy says on Twitter a year ago, oh, we need to actually have a whole new field of study that actually looks at the impact of technology on human beings. And then I and many people wrote back to him, this person, and was like, actually, there are tons of people who have come before you. It's not just you. And here are all these people's names. And of course, the tweet gets deleted and he gets millions of dollars. And now there's a whole new center for the study of technology on the impact of human beings that doesn't even look at the work of all the scholars that have come before him. And I think this is ridiculous. And I see policymakers working with this institution, and I see them thinking as if this person and this group of people discovered this problem for the first time, when on this call here, you see women and people of color who have been writing about this. Because guess what? We have been the ones that have been screwed over by many of these technologies. We're the ones who have to deal with the trolls. And anytime the algorithm doesn't perform correctly, and we're the ones screaming. And then I see policymakers who are in power actually working with these people. And I think that if you're going to go into this space, you have to talk to the people who are being impacted, as Charlton said, because now we actually have engineers and coders and people and social scientists who are people of color. Like, we've been at the table. And so I think policymakers really need to make sure that, just be careful when you walk into a room. Are you working with an organization that's controlled by, is it representative? Do they have a representative board? Where did their money come from? What are the politics and the ethics of these people who are running the organization? Do your homework.
That you feel so passionately about this, and I'm totally with you. The misrepresentation of so many different types of demographics, and not, they, like you say, they are at the table, they do have their voice heard, but they're not necessarily being represented, and that is such a dangerous issue. So just staying on the subject of COVID tracking, so when Google and Apple adopted this decentralized COVID tracking model, it was lauded as a massive win for privacy, but technologies that are privacy aware at the individual level can still be used to target and discriminate against groups. So when data protection and privacy can no longer be effective regulatory tools against discrimination, where do we go next? Tricia, you mentioned personhood, but are there any other avenues that we could potentially go down?
Can I jump in? Tricia, do you want to take this?
Yes, jump in. I don't even know what what Lucy said. So please jump in.
No, I just want to say, it's often called the Google Apple app, but actually it was a European group of researchers who developed a decentralized protocol because they were really concerned, because they saw governments around the world develop contact tracing apps that were incredibly invasive. And the protocol that they came up with, it is privacy enhancing in the sense that it just follows the design principle of data minimization. It does what it needs to do with the least amount of data possible. That said, it could only be we ended up now with an API that's run by Google and Android, and this raises questions that go way beyond privacy. The apps that use this protocol, they are quite responsible for privacy, but it also raises questions about the power and the dominance of these two companies, and the fact that they can sort of decide what kind of infrastructure can and cannot be used for contact tracing is a completely separate issue that is related to privacy, but that's also very different. So I think, as someone who has worked, I feel very passionate about privacy, and the reason I feel passionate about it is similar to where Tricia is coming from, is that we live in a world of data, and how data is used and misused is really closely intertwined with questions of justice and unfairness and discrimination, both globally and socially, and that's why I'm passionate about it. But not every tech question we're facing is a privacy one. They all have to do with data, but they're also about power. They're about existing injustices. And it's true that by fixing, quote unquote, the privacy problem, other sorts of problems can still remain. And I think the API that was developed and then now used by Google and Apple is a really good example for this.
Yeah. So, very conscious of the time at the moment. We're talking, on the kind of negative effects of this kind of thing. But what are some of the positive examples of the internet and emerging technologies helping our preparedness, our readiness to future challenges? Does anyone want to take that? Charlton, you're smiling. I feel like you want to answer this question.
I'm only smiling because none really come to mind. It's typically not where I'm thinking, I think because our history is so replete with the way our use of technologies tend to end. And I think that we too often want to celebrate technological solutionism to the detriment of not thinking about all the ways in which people are negatively impacted. And so I smile because I can't think of any, and it's because I don't often let myself think of it, because there are so many instances that I feel like so few people are talking about and calling attention to, where new technologies are being built either now or for later use to cause the same kind of detrimental outcomes to specific communities of color. And so I'm curious if Tricia, Frederike have any examples. I'd love to hear them as well.
Tricia or Frederike,
let the silence speak for itself.
I mean, I think it's sort of, this is a bit I think for many people, this isolation, we are dependent more on technology than ever before to stay in touch, to have a sense of community in the weeks that we were so isolated at home. And I think I always get angry, sort of Facebook's motto is, what is the motto? Bringing the world together, connecting the world. That's not Facebook's motto. It's actually what the internet intended, and it's something that's very exciting and positive. I think we just need to they're really positive, incredibly positive, exciting things that technology can do. We just need to be very careful that they're not being co-opted by corporate visions of the world that are at odds at these what these statements actually mean if you really think about them.
Visions too.
Yeah,
I think
technology
that's a great
point. And just finally,
neutral. What?
Hey, Tricia, I think we might, or I think you were talking right on.
I don't know.
Maybe just
time lag. No, I was just agreeing with everyone and saying that technology is neutral. I think it's pretty incredible to see. I'm holding Charlton's book right here, and this is a
Thank you.
whole entire. There's like, you should all buy this book right now. But
I didn't pay her to do this.
It's such a great example of that. Like, here's a shitty technology that we're all stuck with, like Facebook and Instagram, and then entire movements are being organized on top of this. And so I think it's a great example of that. It is an incredible, I think what's incredible is a testament to human infrastructure to come together, to work with whatever system it is, like capitalism, like racism, and to figure out how do we build something better on top of this crappy thing that we've been given. And I think that's the story of humanity, is that these systems never work for everyone. They rarely ever do. And so the story is always, how do people come together to form that other kind of infrastructure that is also technology, by the way. It just looks different. There's also code. Culture is also code. And how does that kind of human technology do something better with what this kind of, this digital that we have that is really incomplete.
Absolutely. I feel like we could delve so deeper into this topic, but we have run out of time. It's time to wrap up. It's a really, really great insight from you guys. So thank you so much for sharing, data. We're talking a lot about data, privacy protection. All these things are essential if companies are going to adopt these technologies and continue to build trust in solutions for challenges and anything that might arise in the future. And of course, data-driven transparency, trusting the technologies deployed and the information they deliver, not being harmful to certain target demographics. These are such big things high up on the to-do list that really need to be challenged. They really need to be dealt with. So again, thanks guys for your input. That's the end. Brings us to 25-2. I want to thank my panelists, Frederike, Charlton, Tricia. I'm so happy you were able to join us in the end, Tricia, as well as Nesta and the City of Amsterdam for arranging such an interesting topic. I'm now going to hand back over to Ikenna, and I'll be seeing you later.
Hey, thank you, Lucy. Oh my goodness, that was amazing. That was amazing.
That was a really interesting conversation. I feel like we could have gone on for another hour.
Easily. I am so on Team Lucy, Team Tricia, Team Frederike, and Team Charlton. That was ridiculous. It was like watching your favorite TV show. I was like shouting at the screen, yes, amen, preach, yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, I love that. Thank you very much to all of the speakers and to you, Lucy. I think this is the final session you're moderating. Okay, great job.
It is, yes. Right. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.